Zach sat in the dimly lit living room staring at the untouched dinner on the table. The soft hum of the clock filled the silence, ticking away the minutes as he waited. Maddie was late again. Lately, everything about her felt distant. The way she barely looked at him when she spoke, the forced smiles that didn't quite reach her eyes, the hurried excuses whenever she left the house. It was subtle at first, small changes that could be dismissed, but together they painted a picture he wasn't ready to see. His gaze flickered to her phone resting on the counter. Locked. Always locked now. A pang of unease settled in his chest. He'd asked her once, casually, why she had changed her passcode. She'd laughed it off, saying, "You worry too much, Zach. Work stress is getting to you." Maybe it was. Or maybe it was something else. Zach clenched his jaw, running a hand through his hair. Doubt gnawed at him, relentless and consuming. He thought, back to the nights Maddie came home late, the lingering scent of perfume that wasn't hers, the way she kept her phone face down on the table. Had he really been so blind? His stomach twisted. He wanted to trust her, needed to, but his gut screamed at him. Something was off. And if there was one thing he had learned in life, it was to never ignore a feeling like this. This wasn't paranoia. This was instinct. A casual conversation shattered his fragile hope. Saw Maddie downtown last night. His friend Jason had mentioned over drinks. She looked all dressed up. Didn't see you with her, though. Zach froze, masking the shock that rippled through him. Maddie had told him she was working late. Must have been someone else. Zach lied smoothly, but his pulse roared in his ears. That night he sat in his car outside Maddie's office, watching. Minutes turned to hours. Then, at exactly 9:15 p.m., she walked out, her hand brushing against another man's arm. His heart pounded as he started his engine. He needed to know who he was losing his wife to. Zach parked across the street from the upscale restaurant, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. Through the large windows he saw her, Maddie. She was radiant, her laughter effortless, her smile brighter than he'd seen in years. But it wasn't meant for him. It was meant for the man sitting across from her. Zach's breath came in short, sharp bursts. The way she leaned in, her fingers lightly grazing the man's wrist. It was the kind of intimacy that wasn't accidental. The way she laughed, tilting her head back, was something Zach hadn't witnessed in a long time. Then she touched his hand. A simple gesture. A devastating truth. Zach felt his world tilt, his mind screaming at him to look away, to pretend this wasn't happening. But he couldn't. Because now he knew. A hollow ache spread through Zach's chest as he stared at the woman he thought he knew. How long had this been going on? Who was this man? Was everything, the late nights, the excuses, the coldness, leading to this? His pulse pounded in his ears, drowning out every sound except the deafening truth. She was in love with someone else. Anger flared, raw and unrelenting, but beneath it was something worse, the crushing weight of heartbreak. He had always imagined betrayal to be loud, explosive, but in this moment it was quiet, suffocating. His hands trembled as he reached for his phone. One photo. That's all it would take. Proof. Truth. A moment frozen in time. Zach inhaled sharply, his resolve hardening. This wasn't over. Not yet. Zach leaned back on the couch, watching Maddie from across the room. 7 years together, a home they built brick by brick, laughter that once filled these walls. To the world they were solid, a couple that had weathered storms and come out stronger. He believed it too. Their late-night conversations, their shared dreams, the quiet understanding that didn't need words. It had all been real. Hadn't it? Maddie's voice pulled him from his thoughts. "Did you say something?" she asked, barely. Glancing up from her phone, Zach hesitated, then shook his head. "No. Never mind." She nodded absently, already lost in whatever was on her screen. Something inside him stirred, a whisper of doubt. Mornings were predictable. A kiss on the cheek, a murmured goodbye. Then Zach would head to work. Maddie would go about her day. They were a team, functioning like clockwork, but something had changed. Conversations were shorter, filled with half-hearted nods and empty responses. Touches were colder, mechanical, lacking warmth. Zach convinced himself it was just life, just routine. Work took its toll. Responsibilities piled up. Love wasn't a constant fire. It flickered, needed tending. He was doing his part. Late nights at the office, making sure they had the life they had always dreamed of. But somewhere along the way, Maddie had stopped waiting up for him, and he hadn't even noticed. Zach frowned as Maddie stepped out of the bedroom. A fitted black dress, heels higher than usual, perfume that wasn't familiar. She looked stunning. But something about it didn't feel right. "Where are you headed?" he asked, trying to keep his voice casual. She smiled. Small, unreadable. "Just meeting some friends for dinner." He nodded, but a nagging feeling settled in his gut. Maddie had always been effortlessly beautiful, but lately there was an edge to it. Like she was dressing for someone, just not him. Then there were the glances at her phone, the way her fingers hovered over the screen before typing something, quickly unlocking it. Zach told himself not to read into it, but even as he turned away, he knew. This wasn't nothing. Jason's voice was casual, almost an afterthought. "Saw Maddie at that cafe on Main the other day. Looked like she was deep, in conversation with some guy." Zach forced a chuckle. "Yeah? Probably a coworker." Jason shrugged. "Maybe. Just thought I'd mention it." The conversation moved on, but Zach's mind didn't. That night, Maddie was different. Humming to herself as she washed the dishes, smiling, like she had a secret. He watched her, waiting for her to say something. Anything. But she didn't. Instead, she kissed his cheek and murmured, "I'm heading to bed. Don't stay up too late." And just like that, Zach felt the first crack in their perfect life. The changes were small at first: new passwords on her devices, deleted message threads, calls that ended the moment he walked into the room. Then the social media posts, subtle but telling. Captions like, "New adventures ahead," and "Some things are worth the risk." Zach told himself he was overthinking, that he was seeing ghosts where there were none, but deep down he knew better. Maddie wasn't slipping away. She was walking away, and he needed to know why. It happened in an instant. Maddie left her phone on the counter as she stepped into the shower. The screen lit up. A message. Zach barely glanced at it at first. Then he froze. Unknown number. "Last night was amazing. Can't stop thinking about you." His blood ran cold. His hands trembled as he stared at the words, his heart pounding against his ribs. His breath came in short, sharp bursts. Reality settled over him like a suffocating weight. This wasn't paranoia. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was betrayal, and now there was no going back. Zach lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The darkness of the room pressed in around him, but his thoughts were louder than the silence. His wife's laughter, once familiar, once his, now belonged to someone else. His mind replayed the text message over and over. "Last night was amazing. Can't stop thinking about you." Maddie had been right beside him that morning, kissing him goodbye, smiling like nothing had changed. But everything had. He started watching her more closely, every glance at her phone, every unaccounted for hour. His heart hammered every time she stepped out of the house. He listened to her words, trying to hear the truth between the lies. He couldn't live like this. Not knowing. He had to find out for himself. Zach hesitated, thumb hovering over the screen. The tracking app was ready. One tap and Maddie's location would be his to see. His stomach twisted. This wasn't who he was. He had trusted her, built a life with her. But trust was dead now, wasn't it? With a sharp breath, he pressed the button. The installation was seamless. Maddie would never know. It wasn't enough. The investigator's number burned in his phone's contacts. He had debated for days, convincing himself it was too much. But the doubt, the fear, it was unbearable. That night, he made the call. "I need proof," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. A deep sigh on the other end. "Tell me everything," and so he did. The manila folder felt heavier than it should. Zach's fingers trembled as he flipped it open, his pulse a deafening roar in his ears. Photographs. Maddie. With him. A stranger. Nathan Carter. Their smiles weren't innocent. Their touches weren't accidental. Every stolen moment captured. Dinners bathed in candlelight. Lingering glances. Hands that wandered too freely. Hotel receipts. Messages recovered from a deleted thread. It wasn't a drunken mistake. It wasn't a one-time lapse in judgment. It was deliberate, repeated. His stomach twisted as he stared at a photo of Maddie slipping into a hotel room, Nathan's hand on the small of her back. His home, his wife, his life. Lies. Rage bubbled under his skin. He had his answer. Now Maddie would have to give hers. Maddie barely looked up as Zach walked in, setting his keys on the counter with slow precision. The folder landed with a dull slap on the table. She glanced at it. "What's this?" Zach didn't speak, just waited. Curious, she flipped it open, the color drained from her face. Her throat bobbed, fingers tightening on the edges of the paper. "What is this, Maddie?" Zach's voice was eerily calm, his hands, however, clenched into fists. Silence. Maddie inhaled sharply, closing the folder like she could erase its contents. "Zach, no more lies." Her lips parted, but nothing came out, because there was nothing left to say. Maddie exhaled shakily. "I swear it didn't mean a mistake?" Zach cut her off, laughing bitterly. He shoved the folder toward her, flipping through the evidence. "Which part was the mistake, Maddie? The dinners? The hotel rooms? Or was it just getting caught?" She flinched. "I never wanted to hurt you." His jaw tightened. "But you did. Over and over again." Her hands trembled as she reached for him. "Zach, please." He stepped back. The touch that once felt like home now felt foreign. "I need the truth." Her eyes glistened with unshed tears, but he wasn't sure if they were for him or for the life she had just destroyed. Maddie crumbled onto the couch, head in her hands. "I was lonely." Zach's breath hitched. "You were always working, always busy, and I felt invisible." She looked up, eyes pleading. "Nathan made me feel alive. Alive. Like their life together had been suffocating, like he had been the thing dragging her down." Zach's fists curled. "So you threw away everything we built for some thrill?" Tears streaked her cheeks. "I never meant to fall for him." A bitter chuckle escaped his lips. But you did, she sobbed. I'm sorry. But sorry wouldn't take back the betrayal. Zach's world had collapsed, but somehow he stood tall. The woman before him, broken, begging, was not the woman he had loved. That woman had died the moment she whispered another man's name in the dark. He turned toward the door. Maddie's voice cracked. Zach, please, don't leave. He paused, gripping the handle. You left first, he said, and then, without another word, he walked away. But the anger inside him, cold, simmering, was far from gone. And this wasn't over. Zach sat in. Silence. His hands wrapped around a glass of whiskey, the amber liquid swirling as his thoughts sharpened into something deadly. He had already wasted too much time on rage, on sleepless nights filled with visions of Maddie in another man's arms. No more. Pain had its place. But revenge? Revenge was power. Maddie and Nathan had played him for a fool. Now, he would return the favor. Only this time they wouldn't see it coming. He wouldn't scream. He wouldn't throw punches. He would dismantle them both piece by piece until there was nothing left of the life they had built on lies. With a slow, calculated breath, he pulled out his laptop and started typing. The game had begun. Nathan Carter was everything Zach expected. Charming, arrogant, and reckless enough to take the bait without question. The first meeting was simple. A casual introduction at an industry event, where Zach played the role of an ambitious entrepreneur looking for investors. Nathan, ever the opportunist, latched on quickly. A man with vision, Nathan mused, swirling his drink. That's rare these days, Zach smirked. And a man with resources, even rarer. It took only a few conversations before Nathan started to trust him, dropping his guard in the presence of another successful businessman. The closer Zach got, the more he peeled back the layers, waiting for the perfect opening. Nathan thought he was making a new connection. In reality, he was digging his own grave. The deeper Zach dug, the uglier the truth became. Nathan wasn't just an adulterer, he was a fraud. Buried beneath stacks of financial reports, hidden within company emails, was evidence of embezzlement. Funds siphoned off, numbers manipulated, a house of cards waiting to collapse. Zach stared at the files on his screen, lips curling into a cold smile. Gotcha. With a few carefully placed emails to the right people, journalists, corporate watchdogs, the authorities, the foundation of Nathan's empire began to crack. A single anonymous tip was all it took to set the fire ablaze. Now, all he had to do was watch it burn. News broke fast. Scandal spread faster. Nathan Carter was officially under investigation. His accounts were frozen. His board of directors issued an immediate suspension. Once the golden boy of the industry, now a whispered disgrace. Nathan stormed into his office, phone in hand, voice sharp with desperation. This is a misunderstanding. Get my lawyer on the phone now. But the damage was done. Investors backed out. Clients vanished. For the first time, Nathan was powerless, and somewhere, in the shadows of his destruction, Zach smiled. While Nathan's life collapsed, Zach moved in silence. Bank accounts shifted. Joint assets were transferred. His lawyer worked swiftly, ensuring that when the time came, Maddie would be left with nothing. She still believed they had a chance. That Zach was simply processing his emotions. She had no idea that the man she once manipulated had become a man she no longer recognized, a man who was about to take everything from her. The dinner was elegant, too elegant. Candles flickered, casting soft shadows. A bottle of their finest wine sat uncorked. The scent of Maddie's favorite dish filled the air. She stepped inside, eyes widening. "Zach, this is beautiful." He pulled out her chair, ever the gentleman. "I wanted tonight to be special." Hope flickered across her face. "Does this mean you're ready to talk?" Zach poured the wine, his movements controlled. "Oh, we're going to talk." Maddie exhaled, relief washing over her. She had no idea what was coming. Zach took his time, letting Maddie bask in the illusion of reconciliation before sliding 2 documents across the table. She frowned, glancing down. The first was crisp and official, divorce papers. The second, a collection of photos detailing her affair in damning clarity. Her breath hitched. "Zach, what is this?" His gaze was steady. "Your future." She frantically flipped through the pages, panic rising. "Wait, these accounts are assets. Where is everything?" Zach leaned back, voice smooth. "Reallocated." Her hands trembled. "You can't do this," he smirked. "I already did." Maddie's composure shattered. "Please, Zach, I love you. It was a mistake." He studied her, the woman he had once given everything to, now reduced to desperation. Then, with a final, chilling smile, he said the words that sealed her fate. "You said it was just a mistake." He rose to his feet, buttoning his jacket. "Consider this your last one." And with that, he walked away, leaving Maddie behind, exactly as she had left him. Maddie sat on the edge of her bed, her phone clutched in trembling hands. She had lost count of how many times she had called. Every attempt ended the same. Voicemail. Her voice cracked as she left yet another message. "Zach, please, just talk to me. I know I messed up, but we can fix this. I'll do anything." No response. She sent texts, paragraphs filled with apologies, promises, desperate pleas. Nothing. Tears burned her eyes. This wasn't supposed to happen. Zach had always forgiven her, always given her another chance. But the man who used to love her no longer existed. This time, there was no coming back. Nathan Carter had once commanded respect. Now, he couldn't even show his face in public. His company severed all ties, distancing themselves from the scandal that had tainted their name. His powerful connections, the ones who used to shake his hand with admiration, now whispered behind his back. Every news outlet had the same headline: "Nathan Carter, under investigation for fraud." His phone, once buzzing with calls from investors and business partners, was now silent. He tried to salvage what was left, reaching out to former allies. "Listen, I just need time. We can work something out." But the response was always the same. Doors shut, deals revoked, reputations protected at his expense. The man Maddie had risked everything for was now nothing more than a cautionary tale. It started with whispers, colleagues avoiding eye contact, hushed conversations as she walked past. Then came the emails, clients pulling their contracts, citing concerns about ethical standards. By the end of the month, Maddie was called into a meeting with HR. The air was thick with judgment as her supervisor sighed. "Given recent circumstances, we believe it's best to part ways." "You can't fire me for something personal," she shot back, panic creeping into her voice. A carefully worded termination notice slid across the desk. "We're citing reputational risk. It's done, Maddie." She left the office for the last time, her career in ruins. Now without Zach, without Nathan, without a job, she had nothing. Zach had once been the kind of man who believed in love, who thought forgiveness could heal anything. That man no longer existed. He poured himself into his business, expanding, growing, succeeding in ways he never had before. His mind was sharper, his decisions ruthless. There was no room for distractions. And love? He wouldn't be fooled again. One night, an old friend clapped a hand on his shoulder at a business event. "I gotta say, man, whatever you did to turn things around, damn, you're unstoppable now." Zach simply smirked, swirling his drink. Pain is a great teacher, and he had learned his lesson well. Maddie watched from across the street, her heart tightening at the sight of him. Zach stood tall, exuding confidence, laughter on his lips as he spoke to a woman by his side. A woman who wasn't her. For a moment she wanted to run to him, to beg for another chance. But she already knew the truth. Zach had moved on, and he would never look back. Zach leaned back in his chair, a glass of whiskey resting between his fingers. The ice clinked softly as he swirled the amber liquid, his gaze distant, lost in memories that now played like a cruel montage. The late nights, the hushed phone calls, the way Maddie had slowly pulled away. How had he not seen it? He thought back to the nights she'd come home smelling of a cologne that wasn't his, brushing it off as a figment of his imagination. The times he reached for her in bed only to find her body tense, distant, a stranger lying beside him. "Work's been stressful," she'd said, offering a tired smile. He wanted to believe her. He needed to. But now, the truth was clear. Those long hours weren't spent in the office, and the love he fought to preserve had been a lie for far longer than he cared to admit. Had he been blind, or had he just refused to see? Zach took a slow sip of his drink, feeling the burn in his throat. It no longer hurt the way it used to. There was a time when the betrayal consumed him, when rage and heartbreak had dictated his every move. He had felt weak, humiliated, stripped of everything he thought he knew. But he wasn't that man anymore. Maddie's choices had destroyed their marriage, but they hadn't destroyed him. If anything, they had forged him into something stronger, sharper, untouchable. He had rebuilt his life from the ground up, no longer defined by her disloyalty. Zach set the glass down and exhaled. He wasn't a victim. He was a survivor.